Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon. This is News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. We say Jazakallah to you, the viewer, for staying with us. Of course, we're coming at this time as later on, of course, the team will be bringing you Maulana Tariq Jamil from the Toyando Stadium in Venda. And of course, immediately after that, my conversation with the incoming US ambassador for South Africa. That is going to be none other than Ibrahim Rasool. Now, the developments in Syria are starting to gain a lot of momentum. Currently, as we stand, an interim government is being negotiated. This, of course, happening 72 hours after the Assad dynasty was removed, with the former President Bashar al-Assad removed from his office, and of course, now currently has been taken in by the Russian government. The question is, how long is this transitional government going to be negotiated for? This comes on the back of Mohammed al-Bashir, who was the former head of the rebel administration in the northwest, was speaking to Qatari broadcaster Al Jazeera to try and break down exactly what is going to happen with regards to the future of Syria. You see on the television screens many refugees returning back to their homelands. You see a sense of normality occurring in the streets of Hama, Damascus, Aleppo. So joining us now to break this down with regards to what could potentially occur from a governance perspective and the role the international community may play or may not play within Syria, I'd like to welcome University of Johannesburg International Law Professor Hennie Strydom. Prof. Strydom, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV.
Good afternoon, and to the viewers.
I think, Prof, before we start off, of course, with regards to what could occur with this potential transitional government, let's go back, 72 hours. I mean, 2 weeks prior to that, this rebel group, Tahrir al-Sham, captures, of course, Aleppo, then gets to Hama. But the fact that it happened at such a quick process with Damascus, was that something that caught you by surprise, or were you expecting this?
No, I was totally caught by surprise. After the incident at Aleppo, there was speculation, where will the rebel movement now go? Will they go south towards Damascus? And why all of us were still thinking about it and what could happen. The next moment we heard that Damascus has fallen and that Assad has escaped the country. He's in Russia. So it went at a speed I think no one expected.
Prof, you've been following the developments of Syria. I think when you look at how all of this has changed and how all of this has, really progressed from that civil war which broke out in 2011, how now does this new transitional government say, let's build a supposed future for the people of Syria, but at the same time doing it so when you've got various factions within Syria who of course have their own ideals, and also at the same time need to make sure that this government sees eye to eye on a number of aspects?
It's a very difficult situation that the new parties find themselves in, because the first phase, I think, would be to build trust between them. I mean, if you can't find trust, if you can't trust your partners, then there's always the further option of more conflict. So I think the talks that are going on now will be sort of transitional talks, in a sense of finding one another and getting the sort of ingredients in place for a proper negotiation about the transitional government, what it will be, what its aims and objectives will be, how it will be composed. Those are issues of immediate relevance. But there are also external factors that makes it a very difficult situation to find easy grounds amongst parties at the moment. The one is the returning refugees. I mean, I expect that thousands of them are coming back and will still be coming back in the next weeks or months. And they need to be accommodated. They need to be cared for. And that is the function of a government. So who is taking care of that at this point in time? Who is making the plans for that and providing the facilities and the means to accommodate that number of refugees with infrastructure that is still partly destroyed by war? And you have quite correctly mentioned another pressing issue, and that is the interest that external forces have with regard to what's going to happen in Syria. I mean, the Americans have a stake in that. They still have 900 foreign soldiers on Syrian soil. Iran has a stake in it because it used Syrian soil for Hezbollah. Israel has a stake in it because it's not going to tolerate that to happen. And Israel still is now eyeing the Golan Heights and all of that. Russia has a stake in it because it has given refuge to Assad and it is using air bases in Syria. And then there's Turkey with the Kurdish problem. So you have a whole range of very difficult external issues that will determine how this government is going to deal with that, and what will be the sort of mechanisms that they're going to put in place in order to make that a success. And it will be a long process.
Yeah, of course, they've given it until March 2025, and after that, of course, Syria needs to find a way to try and, of course, create this supposed permanent governance. But I want to stick on that, Prof. Strydom, because I want to make these two case studies, and of course, they happen hundreds of years apart from each other. When we talk of dynasties and we talk about them being there for so long, of course, the Assad dynasty has been there for, close to 5 decades. We look at, of course, the French monarch when it was the French Revolution. Post that, there was a lot of turmoil that occurred. And of course, that produced Napoleon Bonaparte. France was plunged into so much of chaos. We then go to the Russian Revolution when we had, of course, the Tsar dynasty being taken out. You then get communism coming in and the bloodbath that ensued after that. How does wherever these factions are, and of course HTS is going to be one of them, with these other groups, ensure that this transition does not become bloody? You've mentioned it. There are external factors that are at bay, and best believe they are going to insert some sort of influence with regards to this.
I think the trick is to find a solution that is inclusive of all. If a party or some of the parties feel excluded, then you are creating more tension and more potential for further discontent and violence. And let me take you back to the examples that you mentioned. There is a more recent one, and that is Iraq.
Yes.
We knew what happened after Saddam Hussein was deposed. The country went back in terrible chaos, and it is still trying to get out of it. It's still suffering the consequences of that. And I think, I hope that the parties now involved in this new phase in the existence of Syria will take cognizance of that and try to avoid that from happening. Otherwise, we will have more of the same.
Prof. Strydom, I want to touch on the refugees because, that has been such a massive crisis. The Syrian refugees have, expanded to all parts of the Middle East, of course, its neighbors. You then have, of course, Turkey. We then sort of got the migrant crisis occurring with regards to them going on boats and trying to cross into Europe. We saw that happening post-2011. What would the role be of not just this transitional Syrian government in trying to embed them back into society? Because it's 10 years, it's a decade. So much has changed. The world has really evolved with regards to that. But also the role of, the external factors like the European Union and so much more to try and say there has to be a way to embed back these refugees, because a lot of them, even if they were sitting in these Western countries, are going to want to come home and try and insert themselves back there.
I think we can say to one another that many of them will not come back, especially those who already found jobs in the meantime. Sure. Their families have become embedded in the new countries, probably children at school, at university, and so on. So these are human factors that we cannot forget about. And they play a role in determining what decisions refugees will take. And you're quite right. A great effort will have to be made for refugees still willing and able to return, to feel that it is safe for them to return and that there is something for them at the end of the road. If that cannot be guaranteed and the uncertainties remain, they will be very reluctant to return. And you've mentioned a very important aspect, and we must not forget about the political consequences of the refugee crisis caused by the Syrian conflict for European countries. Political consequences in terms of discontent amongst political parties on how the issue is handled or has been handled. And we still see the legacy of that in terms of the new political arrangements between conservatives and liberals and so on. So these are the sort of secondary consequences of any refugee crisis. And this is something that needs to be addressed.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Professor Hennie Strydom. We're going to be touching on what the role of the international community is going to be. Of course, the certain countries that have played their part since, of course, the start of the Syrian civil war. On one side, there's Russia and Iran, who were strong supporters of the Assad regime. And of course, Turkey, who of course played its part in its assistance with regards to the Kurdish part of Syria and the backers of HTS. Do stay tuned. We'll be back after this break. Welcome back. I'm still in conversation with UJ International Law Professor, Professor Hennie Strydom. Professor Strydom, thank you so much for staying with us. I think, Prof, let's start off with the Bashar al-Assad part of it. Of course, Russia and Iran, strong supporters of his regime. I mean, they're hurting right now, aren't they? I mean, I was listening during the Doha Forum over the weekend to the foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, and you could sense there was a bit of hurt from their side, given that even themselves did not really expect this explicit and quickness of the rebel group to go ahead and capture Damascus.
Indeed so. And I think there's another consequence potentially for both Iran and Russia. And it has to do with the atrocities committed by the Assad regime. And we know about the scope and extent of that and the severity of that. And for many years, there are investigations going on in order to gather and record evidence and safeguard evidence. And now that society has opened, I think there will be more of that. And certainly, we may see in the near future that stronger action will be taken in order to bring somebody to justice for the atrocities committed. And that may implicate also countries like Iran and Russia indirectly. So how this will play out, we will have to wait and see. Another issue, I think, for the immediate future is the position that ISIS still has in the country. If ISIS is going to exploit the current instability in the country and trying to gain a stronger foothold, then America will jump in. Those are pitfalls on the road ahead. And the transitional government will have to be very careful about how they're going to handle this and respond to all of this. But I think the important thing is that the outside forces must give the new efforts some space to develop and to show the road and to give the parties involved in this process the necessary scope to decide their own future and decide how they're going to do it. We all hope, I think, that we're not going to sit with a similar situation as we have in Afghanistan. That is another example that has gone completely wrong after, the local parties and groups formed a new government and America withdrew. So this is a very, very difficult situation that we have. And apart from that, we cannot afford more instability in the Middle East. We have enough.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't disagree with you there, Prof. Strydom, because adding to that, you've got the United States of America now. Incoming is President Donald Trump. He tweeted on Sunday whether or not you can really take it seriously, where he's actually stating that, look, America is going to tread very carefully. You've got the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, says that they'll back whatever transitional government comes, but of course, quote unquote, it needs to be in the terms of international society. Prof, where do you see the USA playing its role here? I ask this because Joe Biden's administration was heavily involved in, of course, trying to go ahead and, play its role within the Middle East, and it came to a lot of discontent. Now, the role of Donald Trump, of course, he said it time and time again, America first. Is his administration really going to be heavily invested in what happens in Syria, given that, of course, he's created the slogan, and there's, of course, still this relationship that the United States has with Israel?
No, I think America will watch it only from the point of view what's going to happen with groups like ISIS. Because if that's going to pose a threat to them, then they will, I think, react to that, as they usually do. But you made the point about the involvement of the U.S. In the Gaza issue and the Israeli-Hamas conflict. And that is, I think, is a priority for them to settle that, and the Lebanon crisis. So I think in terms of priority issues, that ranks higher than the Syrian issue. But Syria is not off the map because of the fact that it may have wider implications for the Middle East. And that USA always has interest in. It's watching that all the time. What we do not know at this point in time is how the Trump administration is going to handle it in terms of their foreign policy and what their foreign policy will be. So we have to wait a little while to see how that is going to unfold.
Prof, of course, besides, understanding the Middle Eastern politics, you, of course, have deeply invested within international law. For the last days, you've been seeing the more notorious prisons within Syria, the torture that has been occurring there, the ages of the inmates that have been coming. And it's quite shocking because we're talking about 10 years old. We're talking about teenagers who have been robbed of their entire lives. We've seen many of the citizens within Syria saying that what this has happened has presented them with a new hope, given the deadliness of the Assad regime. From a war crimes perspective, where are we in this conversation? Of course, you've mentioned that Iran, Russia could be, of course, be implicated by their association with the Assad regime. Talk to us about that, and how much does Bashar al-Assad now have to face international law should more revelations come, and these revelations going against the international law perspective?
We can rest assured that more revelations will come because with the prisoners being released, they had their own experiences. They can identify people, they can provide evidence, and so on. And then there are investigations going on into what happened. So the recording and the safeguarding of the evidence will play a very important role. And I want to mention one aspect here. It is very important to decide who assisted Assad, this torture regime. I mean, he didn't do it on his own. And I am wondering where his inner circle are at this point in time and what's going to happen to them. I mean, he cannot face the music alone. I think he's going to try and escape responsibilities and accountability. And that's why he fled to Russia. So, but there must be members of his inner circle still in the country or in the Middle East. And that sort of opens space, I think, for countries in that part of the world to start thinking about prosecutions.
Prof, one final question. Again, 50 years of the Assad dynasty, it's completely over. Where are we in terms of world politics when we look at dynasties like this over here? As they say, the wheels of justice, turn, and leadership positions always turn. But if the case study of the Assad regime is one to be studied, where would you put it in terms of understanding the ever-evolving change of global politics and how this can really be one where if the world's not careful and leaders are not careful, that it would come back to haunt them, especially those who feel that there is absolute power within themselves?
This is a very interesting question you're asking. I mean, I think it's almost unimaginable that a regime of this kind can stay in power for so long and put in place the sort of almost on an industrial scale oppressive system of this kind, and that it can function in that way for many decades. It's almost unimaginable, but it shows another thing. It always comes to an end at one point or another. And that is a lesson we have to learn from this.
Prof. Strydom, thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. You also. That's Professor Hennie Strydom, international law professor from the University of Johannesburg. Again, what is currently happening now is a classic study of when we speak of leadership, when we speak of the end coming, the Assad regime is a classical example. And this should serve as a lesson to other leaders who feel their power is going to be there for eternity. It's never the case. Here at home, the ANC once said that they will rule until the end of time. Well, look what has happened. They dropped below the 50% mark. So it's a classic example that if the citizen speaks, the change will occur. For now, the people of Syria, their main aim is rebuilding their lives, getting back to normal. You see these interviews on other broadcasters where they're now opening markets. There's smiles happening with the people. Hopefully that can extend, because the Syrian people deserve not just a proper form of governance, but peace within its land. Well, that's all we have for you here on News in Focus. Don't forget, later on tonight, Maulana Tariq Jamil coming to you from Toyando in Venda. And of course, I'll be in conversation with the incoming US Ambassador of South Africa, Ibrahim Rasool. From myself, for Hospital, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg, stay beautiful, South Africa. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.